So welcome everyone. Very pleased today to introduce our fourth speaker in this series, Terry Baker. Terry is currently the CEO of the Society of American Foresters, coming before that from a long career with the Forest Service. And so I'll keep that introduction short, but Terry, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to what you have to say. As we're going along here, if you have questions, do put those into the Q&A, and we can ask those. And I believe, Terry, you had a couple other questions that you'll be asking folks as we go along.
Sure thing. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for folks logging in to hear what I have to say. And I always enjoy these opportunities to just engage with folks who are interested in the forest profession or looking forward to practicing, and just have a chance to share experiences and thoughts, because I think that's just one of the more interesting pieces of what connects us all. So so really excited to have this conversation and share some thoughts and hear what you're thinking as well. So I'll do a little bit of an intro, a more thorough intro of myself, but I'll incorporate a few concepts into what I'm going to talk about this evening, and that is that ability to be inclusive. And how do you build that? How do you encourage that? How do you create the space to just have folks from different backgrounds and different places and different experiences be able to share and bring their whole selves to an organization or to a place or to a profession, and some fun ways that I've experienced that in my career, and some challenging ways that I've experienced. And I just think that's just really worthwhile, and glad that you're all willing to have this conversation and think about these critical issues that are really facing our whole profession right now as we try to maintain our relevance and our importance throughout the country and the world. So really excited about that. So as you saw from my bio, I'm originally from the Panhandle of Florida, LA, as it's affectionately referred to by many people, and that means Lower Alabama. So that's where I was born and raised, and did a lot of things that folks who end up in forestry do in their formative years. I spent a lot of time on my grandfather's farm and went fishing and hiking and hunting. And I had absolutely no idea that forestry was a profession or an opportunity or an option. And so I often say that forestry found me. Actually, someone with the U.S. Forest Service, who is a liaison for a program focused on diversity, reached out to me, interestingly enough, in the middle of the night, one night while I was working. He'd called my home and I was not there. I was working at a convenience store, so one of those great high school jobs, and told me about this great scholarship and an intern opportunity that they had, and that he needed an answer by 7:30 the next morning. And I was just like, this makes no sense to me at all. But interestingly enough, the more I thought about it, the more it just sounded really intriguing. And I wanted to talk more about it. So it was one of those things that I kind of stepped out on faith and gave him a call the next day and said, I think I want to give this a shot. And that's when I learned that one of the largest national forests east of the Mississippi was within 40 minutes of my hometown. And so I packed up that morning right after I graduated, and my very worried mother saw me out the door at like 6 a.m. as I drove to the Apalachicola National Forest to start my career in forestry and my career with the U.S. Forest Service at the time. So a really crazy experience, and it was just one of those things where you just never know what may come in front of you and what you try, and where you step out on a little bit of faith and see what happens. So I will say one of those first lessons, that piece of how do you make people feel welcome and included, didn't totally happen to me in my first day with the Forest Service, and it was nothing intentional or meant to be offensive. But and I like to say in true Forest Service fashion, my first day, my supervisor didn't expect me for another 2 weeks. And so I walked in and he said, well, I wasn't expecting for another 2 weeks. And so I have no idea what to do with you right now. We just finished writing this forest plan, which for those of you who have seen a forest plan, those are substantial documents. And so he gave me the new forest plan to read, which it took the better part of 2 weeks to read the forest plan. At that time it was excruciating being 18 and right out of high school reading a forest plan. But looking back on it, again, having no background in the profession, it was a great glossary of terminology and just all those different pieces of what it means to be in forestry and natural resource management. And it was a great foundation. then the interesting way I was included throughout the rest of that summer was I was a walking forest plan. So we're just like, well, Terry, what does the forest plan say about this? I was like, you helped write this. Why all of a sudden are you asking me what it says? But that was just one of those fun moments and things that I look back on. So just a really interesting start into the profession, and great opportunities, great people. And the more I experienced, the more I felt like this is where I wanted to be. This is what I wanted to do. And I wanted to learn more about it. And so from that point, just went through my studies at the University of Florida and at Florida A&M University. Took a semester off and fought fires, which is definitely nothing that's out of the ordinary for folks there in Montana, for those of you who are in Missoula right now, with a hotshot crew out of North Carolina. And was by far the youngest person on the crew. I was 19 and turned 20, which was its own experience, being on a firefighting crew with a bunch of folks that were in their mid to late 20s. And so learned a lot about life in those 4 or 5 months. But one of the things that I did experience that I was one of the first, but definitely wasn't one of the last times in my career where I had a crew member come up to me, and their experience had been with other diversity efforts within the Forest Service that folks were not really brought in for a talent or even an interest. They were there because of the color of their skin or because of their gender, and didn't put a whole lot of effort into the work. And after my 4 months in that crew, he came up to me and said, well, I have to be honest, based on what I've experienced, I thought you were just here to use this as a stepping stone. But you put in so much work to really get everything out of this and be a great contributor. And I look forward to seeing what you do in your career with the Forest Service. And so, it's those types of moments where, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to self-reflect and be willing to admit that, different perceptions that you may have are not expansive and apply to everyone you might meet just because of, what they look like. But there are all types of factors that come into why you may see someone who's different in some various way, but that doesn't necessarily pertain to what they have to offer or what they bring or how they look at the situation. So that was just one of those moments in my career. And like I mentioned, there's been a few of those since then that was just, in some moments it just kind of hits you and you're like, I don't know how I feel about that. But at the same time, there's a bit of pride that comes with that, because in some ways you're like, why do I have to prove myself in this way? But the flip side of that is I did prove myself. And that person now has a different, an additional slide, as we'd like to say in the fire world, on when he meets a person of color in the Forest Service, that necessarily they may be there because they truly want to be there, they truly want to contribute, and not just that one slide of someone who didn't have a lot of energy or enthusiasm about the work that they were doing. So, those interesting nuances of having people from different backgrounds and what they bring to the space that they're in. So of course, from that, finished my time in undergraduate, and soon after went to Yale School of Forestry to work on my master's in forestry. And my great story from there actually was, of course, people from all over the country, all over the world, which was really, really interesting for me, being from a town of probably 8,000 people in Florida, in rural Florida. And one of the best moments, we just started, had about maybe 2 weeks of class, and different groups of folks were getting to know each other and becoming friends. And we had a project, and I was in a group of about 5 folks that I was really becoming comfortable with. And and I had a Florida-ism that came out, or a Southernism that came out, in trying to set up a time to talk with a female classmate the next day. And I was like, oh, well, thanks, Emily, I need to get up with you in the morning to finish this up. And I didn't think twice about it, but like her face just went blank, and everyone else in the circle, all looked at me like, what did you just say? And I was like, I just said I need to get up with her in the morning to finish the project. And so that was an awkward moment. And then it clicked in my head what I'd said, even though being from where I'm from, that's what everyone says as far as just meeting someone the next morning to do whatever. I just propositioned one of my classmates 2 weeks into being in graduate school. And I'm like, and this is why they don't let folks from the South into nice places. So it's just one of those moments that we look back on and laugh. Actually, I'm still friends with Emily today. She's here in DC as well. So it's just one of those funny moments that we can still joke about. But in that whole piece of, when you bring people together from different places, you always have those times where there's going to be awkwardness, and it's nothing that's intentional. And I think that's the meaningful piece is trying to understand intent, which is not an easy thing. Knowing that you may stumble over your words, you may say something that someone may take in a harsh way, and be calm about it and not become defensive. And similarly, also understanding that not everyone who says something to you is intending to offend you. And so it really takes that moment of being able to step out of the moment and look for a little more clarity than the oh so human reaction of just becoming defensive and saying, I can't believe you said that. You're a horrible human being. I never want to talk to you again. And you just learn those things throughout time and throughout experiences and meeting people from different places. And that's just been such a crucial part of my life and my career. So, those were some of those fruitful moments in college. And then, getting into the Forest Service, I quickly learned, and I often told folks, when the Forest Service made efforts to diversify its workforce, as it still does, it's not just about diversifying the workforce, it's about diversifying rural communities. Because a lot of entry-level positions, some of the first positions for maybe some of you, if you choose to work for the Forest Service or even state forestry organizations, are going to be in very rural places. So what does that mean? It means that, community and that piece of what connects us and what binds us to each other is so important and so crucial. And oftentimes you just don't think about it in the ways that you could. And so, for instance, just like me going from the Southeast to the Northeast to Yale and saying something that I'm accustomed saying, and it's just, throws people off. It's that same piece of moving from, Florida, which I did, actually out to Southern Oregon with one of my first jobs, my second jobs with the Forest Service, and working as a forester, and being in a place where there was literally almost no one who looked like me. And I've always kind of been a bit more adaptable, so that wasn't a huge issue, but I know a lot of people that it is very impactful. And that was far enough back where, Amazon wasn't a big thing. And so, I could go to different department stores and there weren't hair care products for me, or there weren't certain things that were just basic things that I was accustomed to that were based on race. And then there were things that were just based on culture. When you move to Oregon, there's not many Krispy Kreme donut shops, and I really like Krispy Kreme. You don't get, you go west of the Mississippi, and grits, which are huge in the Southeast, don't really exist. And people are like, oh, you mean cream of, no, I don't want cream of anything. I want grits, and I want butter, and I want salt. Another one high on that list is sweet tea. It's like, oh, you want me to add sugar to it? No, just don't. That's blasphemy. So it's those different things that aren't, oftentimes when we talk about diversity and inclusion, folks really kind of quickly point to race and gender and gender identity. And there's so many other pieces, because oftentimes, just like in your class, there are going to be people from all over the country, and in some places, different parts of the world. And there's so much identity and experience and things that come with that. That folks are trying to figure out in a new place, and what's that local piece. And so that part of being from that space, or in some cases representing a majority in a community, you have that ability to bring those folks in and really take some of that stress out, because where's the connection? So for instance, for the students who are in this class, that's a connection. For the students at the, in the University of Montana, there's that connection. For me working for the Forest Service, that was my connection to where I was. It wasn't so much that I, being so far from home, I wasn't going to be close to family. I wasn't able to see, the types of trees even that I learned in forestry school. And so the connection really came from my coworkers, and the ability to know that there were people I could just go hang out with, and go see a movie, or go have dinner or lunch, or just have a conversation. Because oftentimes you just don't have any other connections to that space that you're in. And so that ability to actually help those folks engage in those different communities outside of that small circle, so they can expand that circle, or even give them some level of comfort in the time it takes them to just become more settled in that place, is so crucial. And it's the little things. It's not, some massive like, oh, well, taking someone in for the holidays, you don't have to necessarily do that, but you can. And I definitely experienced that in a few different places where, some of my coworkers, especially some of the older ones, where when I couldn't travel for the holidays, they were just like, guess what? You're coming to Thanksgiving with my family. And so I'm having Thanksgiving with a bunch of random strangers and had a great time. But it's just those things that happen, and the things that you can do to let people know they're a part of a place. And how meaningful that can be to someone, and how much of a difference maker that can be. especially when you're looking for that first job. It's not often. I know a lot of Forester students often try to find that first job in their home state, and sometimes it's just not an option. And so if you're traveling 1,000 miles, or like in my case, 3,000 miles away from home, your ability and your willingness to go into that new space is enough of a stress as it is. And then having people who are willing to just, make it a little bit easier, make a whole world of difference for you. It's just one of those things that I've experienced, and that I make an effort to do when I meet new folks and work in different places, and bring in new employees. The different aspects of what connects us and what binds us, what makes things feel more comfortable. Oftentimes, at least from my perspective, and that's part of just where I grew up in the Southeast, is food. The ability to bring people together around food is probably one of the easiest things you can do. And again, part of it's just being genuine. It's not that, oh, well, if you can't cook, I'm not telling you to feed people. That's not going to go well. I would recommend against it. But if you have a little bit of ability to cook and you enjoy cooking, you can definitely bring the masses to you pretty easily. So one of the things I've done in various places in grad school and various work locations, I always barbecue, because it's just something I grew up doing with my mom. And also frying turkeys, which is such a novelty to people. They're just like, oh, is it going to explode? Is it going to set the building on fire? It's going to do none of those things, and you're going to enjoy the turkey. So it's just those moments where you find different ways of bringing your genuine self and just engaging with folks, and what that can mean to people. When I was in Western Oregon, actually, I was there a couple of times. The last was the McKenzie River Ranger District, which is actually where the Goose Project that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later took place. But one of the things that I thought long and hard about when I became a leader in the Forest Service and in forestry was that concept of how people bring their whole selves to work. And what I mean by that is, there's always been there's a stigma of being a professional that's oftentimes extends into almost being not emotional, and it's not, when I say emotional, it's not, having a breakdown at work, but the concept of, separating your work life from your personal life. And the reality is that your work life impacts your personal life impacts your work life. And so how you create the spaces and engage people in a way to be thoughtful of that reality. And from that reality, people can bring more of themselves to work, because it's not this, you don't necessarily have to put on a complete facade of how you have to show up at work in such a way if things are really impacting you, or there's part of your life that's creating a challenge. And probably one of the best ways that I experienced that, or one of the more fun ways as a leader, was when I started as a ranger there. I actually had a young lady who had a baby, and the previous ranger had allowed her to bring her baby into the office. And so after I started, it was cute, but it was one of those things. She was very, very concerned about being able to continue to bring her daughter to work with her. And so it eventually happened. There was like this day she was standing outside of my office, very concerned. I could tell she was very stressed. And so we sat down and we talked, and she told me about the agreement. And it was one of those things where I was just like, sure, I don't see any problem at all. And one of the things that I noticed about her bringing her daughter into the office was it was an office. It was truly an office baby. Like, it was a very calm baby. It could go to anyone. But what ended up transpiring was her desk was a couple of doors down from mine, and so I could actually walk out of my door and see her desk. And what I noticed was every day at about 2:00 in the afternoon, there would be an employee that would come, pick up her baby, and just walk around the office with it, and come like 5-10 minutes, come back and put the baby down. And then there was another employee. And so there was this just circle of people basically every day that would come and pick Emma up and, just kind of walk around the office. And it was like that afternoon pick me up of something that was innocent and wholesome and fun. And that definitely kept Emma calm in the afternoons, and her mother didn't have to worry about her. And it made everyone, just a little bit more happy to be in the office. And so it was one of those things where, you do something just for the sake of believing it's the right thing to do, but then it has these ripple effects that are so meaningful to more people than you even realize at times. And so those are just some of those moments that when you move into a leadership role, you can be thoughtful about those things, and so it's just really one of those great opportunities. Now, The crazy part of that is we had a string, I shouldn't say it this way, but we had a string of births after that. In my 5 years, I believe we had about 25 babies born to employees, so it was quite the experience. We had a lot of office babies, and it was interesting with each one. It was the rest of the staff were more impacted by the first birthday, which was usually when the parents said they were so mobile they had to take them out of the office, and so she's like, "But you can't take them. This is my buddy," and it was very, very cute. But just those moments of bring your whole self to work, how meaningful that can be, and understanding that people just have these different experiences and different backgrounds, and that just inspires them in different ways and gives them more energy into what they're doing and what they can do in the workplace and as part of a team. So since we've made it down the path a little bit to McKinsey River, I do want to jump into the Goose Project, but I've got a question for all of you. But before I give you that question, I do want to jump back really quick to the University of Florida. When I transferred to the University of Florida, I went to the financial aid office and talked with the financial aid advisor, and they looked at what scholarships and grants I had, and they were like, "Well, this is a great financial aid package. What's your major?" And I said, "My major is forestry." And they looked at me and they said, "We do that here?" So that familiar moment of how we're definitely not mainstream in some ways, but one of the things that I kind of look back on that experience is that last year the University of Florida honored me with being one of their 40 under 40 as an alumni, and so it's those moments where I'm not a huge fan of talking about myself, which probably does not make sense with me doing this talk. But being given that award meant more to me related to the fact that I was sitting there with 40 prominent alumni from the University of Florida, and they had a moment to talk about forestry. And there was someone on the stage receiving this award that had a background in forestry and natural resources. And the first thing that came to mind was that financial aid advisor who's like, we have forestry here? I didn't know that. And then, of course, what is forestry? But it's those pieces and those moments where you never know where you can make a difference and showcase the importance of what we do and how critical it is, and being willing to step into those spaces. Because when I was asked to be nominated for the 40 under 40, I was like, I do not want to do this. But at the end of the day, it was one of those pieces where being in this role as the SAF CEO, part of my job and part of my responsibility is how we represent the forestry profession, how we share that broader than just amongst ourselves. And so that was a big part of why I was willing to leave and follow through with the nomination process and then to be selected. So you just have those really interesting moments throughout your career, and they'll definitely come and go, and there'll be things you can reflect on over time. But getting to Goose, which Goose is so entertaining, and I hope you found some very fascinating things. I'd like to ask the group that, for those of you who looked up the Goose Project in Oregon, I'm curious to just hear if there was, and you can write this in the question, the Q&A. What was something that really stood out to you when you did your research on the Goose Project? So I'll give you a few minutes to just write something in the Q&A or in the chat before I give you my horribly biased version of Goose, which is its own interesting experience. Like you said, the awkward silence on Zoom is so much more awkward than it is in person. But something I can do in person, I can somewhat do here. Let's see. Cora Elliott. See, this is the fun of having a participant list. What was something that you thought was interesting or stood out? All right. Well, I guess nothing was interesting, so I guess I'll have to try to make it interesting. So the Goose Project was an interesting one. It was something that, it was a project that was reviewed and analyzed, actually, and the decision on it was signed prior to my arriving at McKinsey River as a district ranger. it was a mix of a few different things. It was a thinning project, thinning in various stands, everything from plantations there in Western Oregon along the McKenzie River, and the communities of McKenzie River and Blue River and McKenzie Bridge, that had happened. And so it was a decision that was signed in about 2009, I believe. And so oftentimes with projects, a Forest Service can sign a decision and then they move on to implementation, but that can take a year or 2 years depending on crews availability, things like that. So that process started with implementation. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. Well, thank you. So the project, they had started implementing timber sale projects in the project area. The nuance to this was it was adjacent to small communities. It was because it was actually pairing up with hazardous fuels projects that the state was doing on private property. And so it was actually conducting thinning projects and hazardous fuels projects on the Forest Service side of the infamous line between private property and public. And then it was also some harvest up in some higher stands and thinning. And so this all started and things seemed to be going well. I didn't have any real big questions and concerns when I stepped in as the ranger, and was a new leader there, and I only been there about maybe 3 or 4 months before things just got a little chaotic. And basically what that meant was there was a gentleman who, I believe he had a summer home that was in the McKenzie River Valley, and he had come over for just to check on his cabin, and there was orange paint up everywhere and timber sale signs, and he was very, very concerned. And so that led to this whole campaign related to this thinning project, which was very, very interesting to get stuck in the middle of, coming from places I worked. And so all of a sudden, the project that I described to you, which, the other piece of it I will say is that it was, there was some spotted owl habitat, northern spotted owl habitat, and the finding was it was not likely to adversely affect, of course. And they conducted an environmental assessment, which is kind of, if you look at some of the tiers of NEPA, you have a category work exclusion, fairly short turnaround, straightforward process. An environmental assessment just means that it's not a significant government action, but there will be impacts. And then, of course, an environmental impact statement, which means there's going to be a significant impact to the landscape, or to resources, or to communities. And so they conducted an environmental assessment for Goose, and a finding of no significant impact, not likely adversely effect for spotted owls. And so that fairly straightforward project then quickly became the Goose Project, that was clear cutting down to the banks of the McKenzie River, and killing spotted owls. So that became the narrative that was being spread about the project. Several things, news articles. There was a moveon.org petition that was started online for people to speak about how the project was, just horrible. One of my favorites, the local newspaper, had a gentleman who sent in an article, and it was very interesting description, and it was very creative writing. He said, "Well, I just heard about the Goose Project, a beast that's been gestating since 2009 and is about to descend on Bethlehem." I was like, "Oh well, that's concerning." I remember reading that article, and I walked out to my office manager, who lived there in the valley, had lived her better part of her life in the valley, and I said, "Brenda, I'm kind of concerned I might be the Antichrist, but I don't know what to do with this message." And so it was very interesting because actually she knew that gentleman, and another part of his article, he talked about the secrecy of the analysis and the project and the decision, and how that was similar to dropping a bomb on Dothan, Alabama, and or testing nuclear weapons in Dothan, Alabama, and no one knowing it's happening. And it just made me chuckle because my hometown that I mentioned is only about 15 miles away from Dothan, Alabama. So I actually invited the guy to come into the office, and we had a conversation, and it was one of those moments where it's just like, here's where moving around to random parts of the country kind of come in handy. And I was just like, "So what made you pick Dothan?" And it's just a great icebreaker because it completely threw him off. But it was that ability and that willingness to just have the conversation, and to not, again, like I mentioned a little bit earlier in the discussion, just not step into the space being defensive and operating from that place of wanting to have understanding. And I did a lot of that with that particular project. And I did it on both sides. So being a new leader, it wasn't just something I needed to do with the community. It was something I needed to do with my employees. There was a lot of concern by the interdisciplinary team that I had on that district that I was going to vacate the decision, that I was just basically going to take their work and throw it out and say, this has caused controversy, so you all of you must be wrong in what you analyzed. And so there was a balance that had to be struck during that time between really engaging and understanding what they wrote and what they analyzed and what they put forward, as well as balancing that with the feedback they were getting. Because again, for many of us in this field, we don't necessarily go into forestry or wildlife biology or fish biology, to be at the front of a controversy and to be called names and be told that, we're horrible people and how do you look at yourself in the mirror? And these were all things that were coming in during that time. And so it was one of those moments where you just have to learn how to lighten the situation, understand what people are going through, and that from their background, they again, you didn't sign up for this, and oftentimes I wish people would tell public servants, like, you're going to get a lot of interesting things, and in some cases they're just downright weird, but it's also about the resources and also about being proud of what you're doing. And so it was just this interesting balance that we took part in over the course of several months. Related to that project and just how we worked with the community, how I worked with staff. We held a public meeting soon after things really kind of built up. And it was interesting because at that public meeting was one of the highest that was ever attended in the Valley. And we had a few moments where there were some presentations early on, and I was one of the ones up there giving presentations for the bulk of the time and just responding to questions. And then that was for the first hour. The second hour, we had maps made that were put on the walls associated with different resource areas, be it recreation or timber harvest or fire management, wildlife biology, fish biology. We had these different maps all over the room. And the second half of the meeting, I basically said to the crowd, is like, okay, well, we've had this moment now for folks who really want to engage in the conversation about what the impacts of this project are to the resources that we're all very concerned about and love very much here in this valley. My staff are going to be at these different maps. And as we kicked that off, I asked my staff to stand up because I was one of the only people in uniform. I asked everyone else to be in regular clothes. And when we made that transition, I made a comment to the crowd and basically said, I asked all my staff who are here to talk with you tonight to dress in their regular everyday clothes and not in uniforms. And the reason for that is I want you to realize when you go talk to them that these are your neighbors. These are the people you go to church with. These are the people who coach your kids' softball team or basketball team. And these are the people you see in the grocery store. And you should look at them as people, not just as the government. Because for various reasons, people can harbor some hard feelings towards the government, and that can get lost. And you can stop seeing people as people. And that's such a critical thing. And so the ability of creating that space to remind folks that this is a person to person. This is a community conversation. This isn't about, villainizing anyone. That time has passed. I took that on in the front of the room. Now let's actually get to problem solving. And it was really interesting to see who stayed in the room to talk and who left immediately. And some of the folks who were the most vocal and the most visceral with their comments quickly left because they obviously weren't there to be part of the solution. They just were there to be upset, apparently. So, there's just those moments and those projects and those things that you just learn different things and create spaces and how to engage folks and be thoughtful and meaningful in those ways of what it means to connect with people. And knowing that it takes time to connect with folks. During that project, I'll never forget, we received, being a public servant, your office phone number and your office email are available to everyone. And so I received, probably well over a couple of hundred emails and who knows how many voicemails of people who were not happy, of course, because I wouldn't be happy clear cutting old growth down to the banks of the McKenzie. And I called them all back. And you've never heard someone be really just caught off guard when you call them back when they've left you a really nasty voicemail and they really don't expect anyone to call them back. And it was one of those things where it's just like, we're going to have a conversation about this. I know what you've been told and I'm here to offer you an opinion, but at the same time, I'd often start the conversation with, I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. I'm just here to share my side of things and let you decide for yourself. That's what I want you to do, is to be informed and make a decision. I'm not here to tell you what you heard or what you believe or what you value is wrong, which changes the entire tone of a conversation and puts people at a place of ease versus, again, I've got to be ready to fight this person because they're going to tell me that I'm wrong and I don't know what I'm talking about. Which really came to bear a little bit later in that process. There was we had tree sitters, so that was a whole experience. But in the article about the tree sitter, there was someone who made a comment that, I felt the same way as these tree sitters about this project. And then I talked to the district ranger, Terry Baker, and he advised me to read the decision document myself, and I did, and I felt really good about it. And I really thank him for that, but I think it's a really good project. And I was like, oh, I kind of took that to my boss, and I was like, I think I deserve a raise. She did not agree, but it's worth a shot. You never know until you ask. And what was even more interesting was there was a comment after that. There was a gentleman who had kind of spurred a lot of the angst in the community about this project. And this was, I printed out a copy of this because I'm like, this is kind of a mantle for me. And he said to this in response to that comment, well, I've met Terry Baker as well, and I have to be honest with you. I think he's a nice guy, but in all honesty, he's a Yale-educated PR specialist that the Forest Service brought in to get this project pushed through. And by the time the community is feeling the brunt of the Goose Project, Terry Baker will move on to the next poorly planned Forest Service project. And then I was like, I'm a mercenary district ranger. Like, that's got to come with a higher salary. Yeah, no, my boss didn't give me a raise for that either. But it was one of those things where as you approach some of those types of interactions, the ability, and it's not easy. Don't get me wrong. It's definitely not easy. The ability to take it for what it is and not take it personally is so critical and so crucial that it makes the world a difference. These are people who, in some cases, never met me or met me for maybe 30 minutes or an hour, and their ability to speak to my character or my motivation is so far beyond any chance of reality. But in the moment, you can take that stuff very personal because it's so strongly worded. So there's just those interesting things that I've learned, especially from that project in particular. And what was great about it was, the interdisciplinary team that we had was truly high functioning, but it was such a diverse team. We had there was an African-American botanist from Arkansas who grew up on a watermelon farm. There was a recreation specialist from South Carolina. There was another recreation specialist from Colorado, a fish biologist from Idaho, a wildlife biologist from Portland, Oregon. And just this really just diverse group of people and diverse backgrounds and experiences. And we built this great team dynamic amongst that group. And it was one where I encouraged it, and oftentimes it was looked at as a little bit odd for folks to truly be themselves. And so it was one of those things that it kind of threw people off. Like, there were times that there was some yelling in IDT meetings, and there was actually once there were some tears. But it was from this place of folks being so passionate about doing a good job and getting things done. And I often mention that, to folks, that just highly functioning personalities take high quality tending. And so it's that piece that people can be so passionate and so great at what they do that it just puts the blinders on. And oftentimes you just have, as a supervisor, as a leader, you have to step in and say, do you really think they meant to take your pen? I don't think they really meant to take your pen. And it could be something just that small and just that simple. But in that moment of being so busy and so stressed, people can lose sight of everything else and just be like, you took my favorite pen and now I don't want to talk to you for a week. And you can't have that in an office. And so that ability to just engage people and understand their personalities and know that it just, it takes that tweaking of just like, hey, have you, stepped out of this moment and thought to yourself, is this as, significant, or is this as personal as you're taking it, or was this just an accident? No one's intentionally leaving you out of discussions. There's those types of things that again, we can all kind of get caught in as people, and what that means, and being able to have that ability or have someone to help kind of snap us out of it is so meaningful and makes such a difference. So, it's just those amazing opportunities and things that we have that makes it so helpful for us. And so, with that, it was that piece of coming into McKinsey River and that ability of, I could have made a lot of different decisions and just, made those in a vacuum, and being a leader that had only been there 3 or 4 months, that would have, probably set the stage for me to not be very successful and maybe leave that location sooner than I would have or should have, because I was acting on my own. But the ability to step in, realize that I was a new leader, realize that I was a young leader, and engage the staff in a way that was truly trying to understand their motivations and their thoughts, engage community leaders where folks could see and get to know me as a person versus just someone who sits in an office. It was that piece of bringing a community together. So that gets back to kind of what I wanted to title this, what I titled this talk, which is an African proverb that someone shared with me several years ago. And that concept of, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, to go together. That you build up that understanding, and there's so much farther that you can go there. Things will continue when you're not there, versus everything being solely dependent on you as that one person. And when you leave, things fall apart, and that happens way too often. So with that, those are just some of my comments, some of my stories, some of my experiences. Happy to share more, but I really just want to give the space for folks to ask questions and just interact with all of you and see what you might think and what your concerns are. And haven't talked a ton about SAF yet, but I can definitely talk about that as well.
Okay, so we do have a question. So obviously there are many situations where the conflict is unavoidable and you have to deal with it as it comes, as you and your coworkers did. Looking back on this particular conflict with the Goose Project, is there anything you would have done differently to try and preemptively lessen that conflict?
That's a really good question. I'll answer that in a bit of a unique way. So like I mentioned, that decision had been made prior to my arrival. And so I will say, in light of what you asked, several things we learned from how people responded and reacted to Goose. We took that into future projects to be preemptive in those places. So some of the things that necessarily weren't done in the analysis process or the community engagement process for the Goose Project, the pushback that we received from the community, those were things that we started to take into future planning areas that we're working on in the district, especially when we knew how highly valued they were to community members. So taking field trips with folks, because oftentimes it's that difference of seeing it on the ground that makes a world of difference, and which seems so foreign right now with COVID, but that ability to step out and have folks talk about what's important, what they value, why they value certain things, and oftentimes you find that people just want to be heard and have forums to be heard. And so that was one of the things that we were really mindful about for future projects, was really emphasizing that upfront engagement, taking folks out in the woods with us and talking through projects, looking at existing projects and active, forest management, kind of giving people that timeline. I oftentimes I get funny looks as a forester to say this, but like, there's no such thing as a pretty timber harvest. It's just not. But at the same time, you also know that within so many years, it can look so different, and folks can not, will not even notice that that's even taken place. And so, kind of walking people through that process is a big piece of it as well. So yeah, I would say definitely huge lessons learned. But looking back, we actually did that. We actually adapted that lessons we learned from Goose. We implemented for future projects and how we engage the community, especially, as well as environmental groups who were concerned about the practices and things that we were doing.
So we have another question. How did access to information shape the project controversy? So nowadays, no one can seem to agree on the facts. I wonder if the community in question could have had more access to information about the project, or could information have been packaged differently? Or was it rather different interpretations of the facts that sparked that controversy?
Oof. All of the above. There were some other, actually, that's a great take off on the last question. There were some other really good lessons learned around how information was made available on the website, and how easily it was searchable online at the time. So that was something that definitely came up and was a big part of how we move forward. Because you're exactly right. You know, there's the basic legal requirements that are associated with the National Environmental Policy Act, which is, you know, posting it in the paper of record, and that's usually just a really small ad. And then there's some other things that you have to do, putting it on the SOPA, the schedule of proposed actions. And so there's these places, but you have to know where to look to get to them. And I think the agency has gotten better about actual websites and actual links and locations, because they used to be very convoluted and long. So some of those things. Also, I think just the ability to share, and again, what resonates with folks. So having some of that community engagement, I think, really made a big difference, just information sharing and having the conversation versus just putting stuff in a newspaper and kind of like letting whoever finds it find it. So I think you're absolutely right. That ability of what the information was. Another part of it was, you know, in a sense, hearing what you want to hear, you know, and where someone's values may sit, and how you can play on someone's value set, you know. So like I mentioned, the ability to sit there and say, you know, this project is clear cutting old growth down to the banks of the McKenzie River and killing spotted owls. That plays on so many emotions for a lot of folks, that you quickly just get into this place where you think the worst. And so that's just part of that challenge, and the ability to just communicate that it's not quite what you read, and how you kind of lead people to their own understanding versus taking the information that's kind of just being pushed at them. And I think that's the other big lesson, is that piece of how do you push information at folks versus kind of just let it be there for someone to find. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's a really good one. But yeah, it's another piece of how you just have to look at it differently, because oftentimes when you work in that space, you're just, I got to get it done. So the regs say I have to put it out this way, and then you can find yourself in a very contentious place. So.
Great. And another question here. So do you ever have to work on a project that you don't agree with? And if so, how do you manage that?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I don't know if I've ever had to work on a project I just like wholeheartedly don't agree with. I know I've had some staff that have worked on projects, and I've had to have those conversations with folks who weren't a huge fan of certain projects. You know, and that's a difficult place to be, because often for a lot of us, you know, we get into this profession, of course, for all the riches that come with it, but more so, you know, because of what we value and what we believe is important, and that ability to steward the land, and that being something we believe is truly valuable. And so when you come face to face with a project that really is opposite or in offense to that value, it's a hard place to be. You know, so that's a concept of just how you approach your professionalism, because there's the ability to take the stance and say, you know, this, I don't agree with this, and this is why I don't agree with it. But oftentimes I would have conversations with employees and say, you have to ask yourself a key thing. You know, you chose to work for the Forest Service, and in this particular, you know, project, this is part of what you know, the agency is charged to do, and you have to ask yourself, is it illegal, immoral, or unethical? Because if it's none of those three things, there's an aspect of being a professional and carrying yourself in a professional manner, and you can voice your disapproval, but you still have to get the work done if it doesn't fall into one of those three categories. So again, that's that place of really taking a kind of a hard look at yourself and what you believe is right and what you believe is wrong. And if you believe it's truly wrong, if you believe it's illegal, immoral, or unethical, you do have grounds to not do it. And but that of course has ramifications, unfortunately. And so there's ways that you have to navigate those difficult situations as well. And you know, retaliation is not acceptable. But I'd be lying to if I say it didn't happen to folks, and I've experienced it. I know others who have as well. And so there's just those dynamics that you have to navigate in your career on what issues or what challenge that you're willing to truly take the brunt of making that stand and what it means. And that's that can be a tough place. But if you feel in your heart that it's right, you stand up for what you believe is right. But there's always consequences. Every action has a reaction. And so those are things you just learn throughout your career, and you learn where you make those stands.
So we have a number of, or many of our participants here are not necessarily foresters. And so we do have a question about what kind of work does the Society of American Foresters do?
Excellent. Well, so the Society of American Foresters is a 120-year-old professional association. And, you know, we're obviously in the name, we're comprised of foresters, but also other natural resource professionals. So there are plenty of wildlife biologists and engineers and as well as recreation specialists, all those different types of folks within the association. So we do a variety of things, but kind of at that core, we're committed to the scientific, sustainable management of you know, America's forests. And so we do that in different ways. So the program that the forestry and students are in there in Montana is an accredited program by the Society of American Foresters. So we accredit forestry degree programs across the country. We also have 2 peer-reviewed journals where forestry professionals and natural resource professionals can submit their research for publication. We do also publish books and provide forums for people to share information and technical expertise. We also have a certification, so we certify professional foresters throughout the country, and we also provide continuing education opportunities, host a large national convention, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, so we're excited about that. It'll be our first ever virtual convention. And really, in a lot of ways, provide great networking and leadership opportunities for folks in their volunteer service to the organization, as well as advocate for forestry and natural resource issues here in Washington, D.C., and that's where our headquarters is located here. So, so for initiatives that you've probably heard about, 1 trillion trees, different legislation related to climate change and forests, and especially reforestation practices, things like that, we're engaged in a lot of that. Wildfire policy and legislation. We work with that work as well, with a variety of partner organizations here in DC. So we're all over the board and doing our best to communicate the importance of forestry and supporting forestry professionals and natural resource professionals in their education and continuing education, and also providing forums for them to engage with each other, share information. As we talked about early on, that sense of community is a big part that SAF plays across the country for professionals in this arena. So that's a quick and dirty of what we do. There's several other things. Obviously, we have student chapters all over the country as well, and look at different forums to engage those students and showcase what they're doing and how they're looking at changing forestry and natural resource management. So just a great organization to be a part of. I was a member for 20 years before taking this position, and really honored to just be in this role. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into SAF.
Thank you. And so another question, you spoke of one incident of racism earlier in your, early in your Forest Service career as a firefighter. And this questioner is assuming that you probably experienced many more incidents during your time with the agency. So based on your experience, did you perceive any trends? Are things getting any better? And were there any notable regional differences?
Oof, that's a big question. So I'd say first and foremost, you're correct. There definitely were other instances throughout my career for me personally, and then a lot of firsthand accounts that I had, different professionals that would share with me about their experiences as well. You know, were there regional differences? I would say there were some. I would say that, of course, you know, being in the Southeast and growing up there in a lot of ways, and where I grew up, you know, there's a lot of that. There was a bit of a concept of, I want to say that racism was okay, but it was almost an understood part of the culture in some instances. So there was the ability, like the people who truly did not like you solely for the color of your skin, they did not hide it. And so it was almost like you knew where the lines were, and it was a lot clearer. As I went west, there was less of that. And so it was one of those places where you didn't quite know who to be careful around or who to avoid. because there may be some, random piece of animosity. I will say often that related to some of my own experiences, but also some of my some staff that I've had over the years, places that oftentimes are kind of described as being these liberal strongholds and mostly red states or large red states, that there are tough times in those spaces as well. I had one employee I had to talk with when he had a really rough experience, in Eugene, Oregon, where there's University of Oregon, and it's very, very liberal part of the country, and ways that you wouldn't even understand or know, because Eugene's one of 2 cities in the state of Oregon that has a topless ordinance. And you heard that correctly, that you can be on city property with no top on, and makes for an interesting life, but that's a whole other set of stories from my career. But this particular employee, who was African American, he was just walking down the sidewalk one day, and a young lady was with, who was probably high school, college age, with 2 guys beside her, just walked up to him out of the blue and says, like, I could beat the black off of you and no one would do anything. So I mean, there's those moments that you wouldn't quite expect, kind of given what you see on the news. You're like, oh, Eugene and Portland, that's just weird, and they just love everyone, and you're like, oh, or not in some cases, and in some instances. So yeah, in one place I worked, this shocked a lot of people. I worked in central Nebraska, and had a great time there, and really, it was extremely welcoming. Now, you could say that had a lot to do with the position I held. I was a district ranger, which in those really small communities, it's like being a mayor almost. So there could have been a bit of that, but just a great deal of respect and engagement, and didn't have the slightest problem or issue with my race there. There were some interesting moments. When I first arrived, I went to the post office and walked in to set up a P.O. box, and the little old lady behind the counter kind of just looked at me. He's like, "You must be Terry." I'm like, "How'd you know?" So there's those different things. And I will say one of the other pieces, especially spending quite a bit of my career in the West, and going to some rural communities, there's also the aspect of pure curiosity. And I've experienced that a lot, where folks have only, experienced, for lack of a better term, African Americans and via television. So it's, someone they've watched, it's something they've seen on the news, or maybe it's an athlete, or, football games, or whatever it might be. But not really just like someone who was just there in their community day to day, or in particular in some of the places I've worked with the Forest Service, or just even people that they've worked with that was interested in forestry. So sometimes you have this added piece that often isn't often talked about, of being almost an ambassador for an entire demographic. It's just like, well, Terry, why aren't there more people of color in forestry? I'm like, well, since I can speak for all of them, let me tell you. So it's an interesting dynamic, and it's that piece of being honest and true to your own experience, and sharing what you've experienced, and knowing that there are other experiences out there. So hopefully that answered your question. That was a really good one. Thanks for asking.
Well, Terry, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for your presentation today. I know we have a number of comments here thanking you for that, for your perspective on this. Yeah, we certainly appreciate that, and look forward to a time when hopefully you can come visit us in person.
Same here. I'm all for it. I am all for it. No, thank you so much for the invite, and best of luck at figuring out all the things associated with learning in a pandemic. Give yourselves a little bit of a pat on the back. You may not think about it, but it makes a difference to be willing to pivot and shift in these times that, the world just keeps changing around us. So take pride in that, do great things. And I look forward to, again, that time when I can come out and meet you in person. I'll put my email in the chat box. It's pretty easy to find. But if folks have other questions, or want to ask me really anything, happy to make some time. I may not get back to you too quickly right now because of the convention, but I'll definitely get back in touch with you, and just, happy to do whatever I can to help. So best of luck. Thanks again, Beth, and thanks for having me and the invite, and just all the best.